Welcome back to Arizona Laserworks, in the series where I learn by doing. Today I'm taking on the most complicated project I've tried so far. We're jumping in a little late on this one. By the time I started filming, I spent a few days finalizing designs, cutting, staining the wood, and completing the resin inlay, which brings us here. The whole thing will be solar powered, using a compact control box containing the panel, light sensor, and battery all in one. For the lighting, I'm using a strand of 100 low drain LEDs, giving it a bright glow while ensuring the battery still lasts throughout the night. I designed the housing so that the whole thing would fit snug into the main body while hiding the assembly and electronics from view. Once I know everything fits, I tack it in place with glue before locking it in place permanently with resin. Turns out the glue and I have a lot more in common than I thought. Me too, buddy. Me too. Once assembled, I leave it to dry while I work on the base. The plan is to cut out and join together 9 boards to make sure the base is strong and stable. After they're cut, I flood the layers in glue and clamp them tightly together. Once dry, I make sure the whole piece fits tightly into the base of the body. Next, I use twine to wrap the lights to the exact shape I want, and then use tape to place the bulbs evenly over the surface. I attached a quick connector to the power module so I can quickly make sure the power functions correctly throughout the process. While that dries, I head to the hardware store to get the mount for the base. I don't know what I was doing here. I ended up deciding on a 3/4 inch galvanized steel mount to make sure everything stays securely in place even in high winds. I realized I hadn't yet stained the base, so I took care of that before marking where the bolts go with a pen and then drilling the mount holes. I affixed the mount to the base with some nuts and bolts for a tight bond, then later I'll use epoxy to fuse the base piece to the main body to make sure it's as stable as possible. When finished, luckily the whole thing fit together perfectly. Then I coated the interior with a thin layer of resin to ensure everything is entirely sealed. And then I lowered in my lights. Now, for this to work, I needed to make sure the lights were centered without having to use an entire gallon of epoxy to hold them in place. So this is what I ended up coming up with. I added in about a cup of resin at a time, rotated the entire piece and let it sit for about an hour on its side, then rotated again, repeating this over and over again for about 8 hours. This slowly resulted in a spiderweb-like pattern of resin that suspended the bundle of lights right in the center of the body. Next is the exterior, but first, it was kind of anticlimactic. I'll give it a 6 out of 10. I started by covering my counter with plastic wrap, and then I measured and mixed the epoxy and brushed on a thin coat to the first side. PSA, don't do that. Using a brush, not what you're supposed to do apparently. It all started to pool pretty quickly due to surface tension. I tried to fix it before torching it to remove some bubbles, and unfortunately this is how it looked the next day. I decided to give it a rough sand and try another layer. I read online that a little rubbing alcohol would reduce the surface tension and make applying it much easier. So I decided to try this approach and mixed in about 5% alcohol by volume. I then re-poured the resin and made sure I got an even coat over the full surface. I removed the bubbles again and then left it for the remainder of the day. This was a mistake. 12 hours later, it hadn't even begun to cure. At this point, it was about midnight, which only gave me 3 more days until Christmas, which was my deadline. So with a plastic scraper, an old rag, and a bottle of rubbing alcohol, I went out into the cold to begin removing every bit of the uncured resin from the body, the power module, and ultimately my shelf. I scraped off the majority, followed by lots and lots of wiping with an alcohol-soaked rag. All in all, it really only took about 45 minutes to fix this mistake, but in total I lost over a day and needed to find a new approach fast. I decided on just doing a normal full pour over the body and prayed I sealed the wood good enough that I would avoid any bubbles from forming. Before I was trying to pour it in a way that I could avoid any drips and have to skip the step of sanding later, but that was pretty unrealistic. I mixed up another batch of UV resistant resin and made sure to get it as perfect as possible. The next morning it looked good and the whole thing was cured enough that I could rotate and work on the next side. I repeated this process 3 more times, turning the piece and pouring a new layer every 8 hours or so. After another full day, everything had finally cured and I was able to saw and cut off all the large drips to make sanding a little bit easier. It only took about 30 minutes using 240 grit to get the surface nice and flat. Then I used 400 to smooth everything out a little more, and then about an hour or so wet sanding at 1000 grit. Next it was time to start polishing. I didn't want to do it by hand and I don't have a buffer, so this is what I came up with.
I'm wearing a mask.
I'm not a smart man.
The smoke actually smelled exactly like cooked bacon, which was somehow kind of concerning. it was actually pretty surprising that it worked. I added on a bit of sauce and began the long process of buffing out all that I could. By the time I finished, I noticed there were still quite a few deep scratches from the initial sanding. I decided to work all these spots out by hand with a bit more wet sanding at 1000 grit. After that, I worked my way through finer and finer polishing compounds until I went from this to this. But in the end, the final look was well worth the effort. The last step before the final assembly was making the electrical a little bit more permanent by soldering the connections. I wanted to make sure this thing would hold up over time. And after that, it was time to put everything together. I did one last test before calling it finished. This project was definitely a fun challenge, and I learned a lot through it, and I'm very much looking forward to the next one. And as always, I have no idea how to end this, so okay, love ya, bye. And if you're still watching, I just wanted to take a moment and say thank you, and I'm officially taking new orders now that the holidays are over, so feel free to reach out to me here or email me at azlaserwork@gmail.com. It would also mean a whole lot if you could follow, like, and share this video so I can keep doing cool projects like this in the future.